Now it's my pleasure to introduce Philip Dabney, and he is an attorney here in town. He did this talk a couple of years ago, and we had requests for this again. So it must have been really great. So it is my pleasure to welcome back Phil Dabney. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Phil Dabney. I'm an attorney in town. I have a small practice called Philip J. Dabney, PC. I'm currently practicing with a couple of attorneys. One of them is a young lady by the name of Emma Weber. Emma was going to be here to help me today, but she became ill this week, so she's not available. But Emma is a new attorney working for me. She's been practicing about 8 years, and she is a New Mexico native. Her husband works at the lab, and she moved up here about a year ago. So I began looking for a new attorney about the same time that she was looking for a new opportunity to practice up here, and Kismet worked, and we are now practicing together. We are the byproduct or the succession plan of Reid Griffith. Some of you probably know Reid. Reid's been practicing here for 45 years. From the moment that he got his degree from the University of New Mexico Law School, he moved up here. He worked for the district attorney for a couple of years, and then he started his own practice, first down in White Rock and then up here in Los Alamos. And we're going to talk a little bit about his experience in trying to find a succession plan because it's relevant to our discussion today. This is my disclaimer. We're a general practice law firm, and we do not specialize in succession planning. I'm going to give you some 10,000-foot views of what succession planning is all about and some ideas about how to do succession planning and how to, what kind of documents to use and the professionals that you want to look to besides lawyers to help you with succession planning. Also, before we go any further, I want you to know that I did this presentation, I believe, the day after the presidential election. And I thought it would be kind of cutesy and relevant and topical to use a certain presidential candidate as an example of some succession planning ideas. So you're going to see Donald Trump's name in here and a lot of Donald Trump stuff in here, not because of any political reason, but because it's a relevant piece of information for succession planning. All right, so there are simple ways of succession planning. I don't know if any of you have been to Las Vegas and seen the Penn and Teller show. Teller is the guy who doesn't talk. Penn is the big guy who's gregarious, and they have a magic show. Anyway, Teller is the son of Joe Teller, and I don't remember his mother, but he grew up, I think, in Philadelphia. His parents were a little bit quirky, and they collected all kinds of weird stuff, and they were artistic. And this book is just kind of a fun little discussion about all the artifacts that Teller inherited when his parents died. Not in a business way, but just that was his succession plan. Succession planning has been around for a long time. This cartoon is from the Teller book. It says at the bottom, "You're too meek, you're not inheriting anything." It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek biblical cartoon, but the point is succession planning is as old as the Bible. God has a succession plan, that the meek shall inherit the earth. Then we have the more complex ideas of succession planning. This is Trump Tower, and Donald Trump has a succession plan for his business operations. Once he was elected president, he needed to decide what to do with his businesses. And the article that I'm citing here says that he had plans, and I think that he carried it out to a degree, depending on which news article you read today, to separate himself from his company and hand control of his company over to his next generation of family members. Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric Trump serve as executive vice presidents of the Trump organization. My understanding is that these children did not just graduate from college and become vice presidents of his corporation. Donald put them into various positions where they learned the business operations and worked their way up to the level that they are at today. That's a successful business succession plan. If you take your kids and elevate them to vice president immediately without any training or education or knowledge of what your business is, that's not a good idea. All right, so one question you have to ask yourself: what is it that you're having your family member, your business partner, your relatives get as part of your succession plan? First you have to ask, what kind of an entity type do you have? Are you a sole proprietorship? If so, succession planning is a little bit simpler and easier to accomplish. If you're a corporation, a limited liability, or a partnership, all those types of entities create different issues and different methods to think about for succeeding operations in your business. Number two, you have to figure out what kind of assets you have that are important for your succession plan. Do you have furniture, fixtures, and equipment that are important for your business? Do you have computers, equipment, buildings, customers, customer lists, intellectual property, trade names, your reputation, and what we call blue sky, which is goodwill? All of those things are of value and have some aspect or have some important element of your business. And depending on what kind of business you have, there may be other things, and some of these things may be important than others in terms of figuring out who gets what when it's time for you to either retire or turn the business over to somebody else. Then we want to talk about structure of who's going to take over. Do you have family members who are going to become the new owners of your business when you're done? Are your employees going to take over? Who are the vendors and the contractors and the trade partners and more importantly, who are the customers, and how will they be affected by whatever you do to keep your business alive and have it go to the next generation? Then we want to talk about methods of succession. One of them is right there. Let's sell the business and have somebody else take over. And there are different ways to sell your business. One of them is the simple, when I'm dead, you're taking over, son. It's all yours. One way is through estate planning. You can set up an estate plan that includes a succession plan for your business. And it can be simple, it can be complex, depending on what kind of business it is and what kind of estate you have. There are the franchise concepts, okay? The big M, the big double arches. Ray Kroc started a hamburger stand. And he got this idea to franchise it. And so now it's a multi-billion-dollar organization. He's been dead for many years, but everybody knows what those double arches are. So franchising is a way of succession planning that keeps your business alive long after you're gone and it possibly could spread all over the world. So we have some franchises here in town. Can anybody name any besides McDonald's? Domino's is a franchise, and it's an interesting and cool franchise operation where the business owners who buy the franchises typically are the people who started working at Domino's, delivering pizza or making the pizza. Many of their current owners of franchises are former employees. So that's a really cool concept where people can start from scratch and work their way up into a business and learn it from the inside out. Any others in town that you can think of?
El Paso, is it?
I think El Paso is a family-owned business with a few restaurants around town, but I'm not positive about that. They should franchise because they have a pretty good operation.
If they could keep that quality.
Yeah, that's the key in franchising. One of the aspects of franchising is there is an agreement that typically, especially in a food franchise, requires a certain level of quality. You often have to purchase your merchandise from the franchisor. You have to meet inspections from the franchisor, those kind of things. Any others in town that you can think of? Smith's. Well, I don't know if Smith's is a franchise. Smith's is certainly a large business organization. And they have grocery stores all over the world. They used to be part of a smaller entity called the Smith Food King, but now they're part of a larger entity. They got swallowed up in a merger and acquisition, and they're now owned by the Kroger Corporation. But I don't think they're a franchise. I think they're more of a large corporate entity. Supercuts is a franchise. They are similar to Domino's in that they have little shops all over the country, and you can buy their franchise, and you have to develop your building the same kind of concept that other Supercuts has. There's one that I'm thinking of that's kind of the opposite. We have a franchisee of a franchise in town that also is a family-owned business, Metzger's. So Metzger's is part of the Do It Best hardware chain. It's a franchise. We also have a hardware store called Ace Hardware, which is a franchise, and they have franchise operations where you can buy into their operation and become your own business. The interesting thing about Metzger's is that franchise system allows Metzger's to keep their name out front. So we all recognize Metzger's as Metzger's, not as Do It Best. So it's a different kind of a franchise concept. So then we have the Donald Trump way of training in business, and he's got a book that apparently is pretty good. I haven't read it, but it's called Think Big and Kick Ass. But this is, again, the concept that he has, which is, he basically inherited wealth from his father, who was a real estate developer in the New York City area. And then he, branched out and built the Trump Tower. He built hotels and casinos. He's developed golf courses. And so he's basically been a real estate developer like his dad, but he's expanded the concept into a much larger thing. And then he became a TV personality, of course. And so his vast operations are now being taken over by his children. When you have a huge personality like Donald Trump, and then he turns it over to others, you got to think about, well, what's that going to mean for the succession of his business? Is there somebody else who's going to become the next Donald Trump, or is it going to be more like other real estate development companies who are more low-key and just operate and own businesses like they do? So here are some tools to think about for your succession planning in your business. You need to groom successors. And again, Donald Trump, his personality created this TV show called The Apprentice. The concept is interesting and leads to somebody getting fired at the end. But the underlying concept is good for succession planning. You want people to learn your business from the inside out in order for them to take over, be it your family member, your employees, or even an outsider who's coming in. You want them to know your business before they become the next owner of the business. You need to evaluate what you're selling, whatever your business is. You need to know what it's worth before you decide how it's going to be taken over by others. So there's different ways to do that. You can get a professional business appraiser. You may have a CPA or an accountant who's involved who can help you figure out value based upon your annual revenues. And there's a concept called fair market value that comes from the appraisal process that gets you some idea of the value of your business. And if you're selling it, then you can use that as an asking price. But if you're, bringing somebody in, you need to have a starting point for somebody buying interest in your company. And this is one way to do that. You have to evaluate. Then you want to come up with different types of business agreements that you can use to create a succession plan for whoever's taking over your entity. There's a concept called employee-owned stock companies, ESOPs. And contractors, construction businesses use the ESOP process to create a company that's owned by the shareholders, by the employees. They become the shareholders who own the business, and they then have some interest in its success or failure that's more than trying to work for and earn a bonus. It's more we want to keep this for the future. We want to build it and become more successful and groom our other employees to become owners of the corporation as well. There's a small company in Nevada called Clark & Sullivan Construction that created this concept for their business, and it helped them to get over some financial troubles that they were having and to build for the future, so that they had an ongoing entity that continues to build construction projects for both commercial and residential projects in Nevada. You can, if you have a limited liability company. So let's talk a little bit about what the difference is between corporations and limited liability companies. Not a lot. Except that corporations are the older type of entity that was created by lawyers and accountants and others to give a business entity some owner or some existence outside of its own owners. So a corporation is an existing entity that can be considered a person in many regards. They have due process rights. They can, file different documents and participate in various things. It creates a basis to prevent liability being attached to the owners of the business if something catastrophic happens, like a terrible accident where somebody's killed. And of course, insurance is an important part of that too. But entities like corporations are intended to protect owners of the business from catastrophic liability. Limited liability companies are similar to that, but they're structured in a different way, and they're more simplified, and for income tax purposes, it makes it easier for the business to pay their taxes in a way that doesn't create double taxation and that sort of thing. So it's but the different types of documents for corporations and limited liability companies are have an impact on how the entities are operated. A limited liability company is intended to be more simplified. You can have a single owner limited liability company, but if you have multiple owners, you create what's called an operating agreement that kind of lays out the duties and responsibilities of the various owners and how income is dealt with and how expenses are paid and the annual meetings that take place and that sort of thing. There's a document called a BuySell Agreement. So if you have an entity such as a limited liability company or a corporation or any other type of an entity where there are owners who have a share of ownership interest, like even a partnership. And a partnership, in comparison to a corporation or a limited liability company, is where people get together and they share in both the liability and the success of an entity. And there's different types of partnerships. A limited partnership creates limited owners who invest money, but they don't have exposure for liability. But the general partners do have exposure to liability. So it's a little more dangerous to own a partnership because you have potential for exposure to liability that you don't have in a limited liability company or corporation. But a buy-sell agreement is used in any of these type of entities to create a process for partners to buy into companies or to get out of companies. And with the use of insurance, a buy-sell agreement creates an agreed-upon process to deal with the death of an owner in a business. We use these types of agreements in law partnerships, so that if a partner buys in and then passes away, the family of the business, of the law firm or any other business, will get compensated through an agreed-upon insurance policy that exists to compensate them and to prevent the business from basically being eaten away by having to buy out partners who pass away. There are documents called self-canceling installment notes. So if you have a small business and you want somebody to buy your business, you can create a process where they're paying on an installment note. And that installment note cancels out upon the occurrence of an event, such as the death of the founding owner who's receiving the money from the installment note. And then you have to think about different types of agreements that take place in the event of a sale or other succession process of a business. So an example of this is, in many cases, businesses decide to sell to somebody else. And so they'll hire a business broker, and they'll, quietly list the business for sale, especially in a small town, because they don't want people to know that the business is for sale. And when they find a buyer, the buyer will say, well, I'm from Hoboken, New Jersey. I don't know anything about Los Alamos, New Mexico, so I need somebody with boots on the ground to help me, get acclimated to the community and to learn how to run the business. So my proposal is I'll pay you X number of dollars to buy your business or your assets, and I will hire you to be my employee to manage the business for a certain period of time, and I will pay you X number of dollars. And then when you're done, you have to agree not to compete with my business for X number of years or months in a geographic location after I've retired or after I've bought the business from you and you've stopped working for me. So that's a standard kind of way to sell your business to somebody from the outside. Outsiders don't want to come into a small town and try to figure everything out if they don't have the knowledge or the understanding of the community. And having the original owner there helps to carry over that goodwill and to help the new owner learn the business and help the new owner learn how to become introduced to important members of the community, that sort of thing.
Bill?
Yes, sir.
One question on that. Would the business owner, the seller, be in a better position to carry the paper himself on that? And have the new owner pay him directly?
So the question is, if you're selling your business to a buyer, and the buyer is wanting to borrow money to buy the business, doesn't have the full cash to pay for the business, do you set up a note where you're the holder of the note and you take the payments and you have to deal with any default? The answer is it depends. Anybody who's selling a business would probably prefer to have cash, simply because cash is king, and if you can get the market value of your business up front, you don't have to worry about getting paid. There are reasons oftentimes to have that kind of an arrangement that typically deal with the buyer not having the financial wherewithal to be able to get a loan from a bank or another lending institution to be able to buy you out and pay you the cash. The dangers of doing it the way you're suggesting is that if the buyer defaults, you have to go collect the money. In some ways, that can be good if you set it up right. I'll give you an example. When I practiced for 30 years in Las Vegas, Nevada, one of my clients owned a bar, a series of bars. It was a couple of twin brothers. You probably heard of the pubs called PT Pubs if you've ever been in Las Vegas, Nevada. They were the developers of that concept. They built a bunch of bars in town, and then some of the bars underperformed, so they would list them for sale, and they would sell them to various people, but they would take back the paper, and they would have to, they would accept payments, and then if the buyer defaulted, they had security, so that all the furniture, fixtures, assets, if they owned the building, everything about the business was a security interest that was held by the seller. So when the buyer defaulted on the note, the seller would take the business back and sell it to somebody else. And they would get a big down payment, they would take the paper, and sometimes that happened 2 or 3 times because the places that they were selling were underperforming. And so if they didn't have, if the business buyer didn't have a game plan for figuring out why it was underperforming and how to get it to come back, then they would lose the business and it would go back to, but that can be bad too, because if it's underperforming and you take it back and you can't find a new buyer, you're kind of stuck. You didn't get all the money and you're stuck with this asset that doesn't perform.
But in the meantime, you have been, we'll say for instance, that this happens after 5 years.
Yeah.
You've gotten 5 years of payments from your buyer.
Then you can take it back and you're in pretty good shape, especially if you can find a new buyer. So yeah, they probably made a lot of money that way. Anyway, yeah, the best way to do it is to get cash up front, but if you can't do it that way, you want to set up a payment arrangement that includes some security that allows you to, make sure that if there's a default, you can get back what you sold. So, all right, so many of the small business world considerations involve family. I grew up in a family in the Midwest where my dad started a paint and decorating business. And he put my brother and I to work before we were probably old enough to work, and in that business, doing all kinds of different things. And as we grew up, we both worked in the business for him. And he wanted one of us or both of us to be his successor in the business. But at least one of us wasn't interested in doing that because we wanted to go to law school. And he didn't like that, but that's just the way it works out. Many businesses that are family-owned have one or two children or other family members who come in and learn the business and then take over and become the next generation that owns the business. But that creates a question of, well, what about the other family members who don't participate in the business when mom and dad, the creators of the business, pass away? What do they get? You have to take that into consideration. You also have to make sure that when Junior gets married or when daughter gets married, who's in the business, that there's some protection in place, especially if it's a large financial success. You want to create a process or a method to prevent, in a community property state like this, a divorce from creating a disaster for the business. So here's what could happen. So in a community property state, when you get married, everything you acquire while you're married is community property. It belongs to the community, the marital community. When you get divorced, that marital community has to be divided, both assets and debts. Excuse me. So if you are in a family business that's doing well, and then the son who's running it decides to get a divorce, what happens? Well, the wife is entitled to half of that business, and or half of his interest in that business. And that creates a problem for the family business because now you're going to have a non-family member involved in the business. And there are ways to solve that even if you don't have something in place, but it can be very expensive because you have to evaluate the share of the business and figure out a way to buy out that divorcing spouse. You can do it ahead of time through prenuptial agreements of sorts that create a process and an evaluation for that interest, but make it clear that the divorcing spouse will not be an owner of the family business. And of course, there's the whole estate planning process that is done both in non-business settings and in business settings. If you're a person who owns a business, either as a sole proprietorship or an entity, you have to figure out how to transfer that business to somebody else after you die if you still own it. So there are various estate planning tools through trusts, through wills and different types of trusts that will create a method for transferring property after your death in a way that keeps the business from basically collapsing. And then considerations about family fairness are important, as I talked about earlier. If you have family members who are not participating, and this occurs in family farm situations, for example. You might have a family farm that was started by dad and is now 10,000 acres of fields of wheat and corn or whatever, vegetables, and the husband and wife who started the farm had 15 children, and only 3 of them are now operating the farm. So what happens when mom and dad pass away? Who gets the farm? Well, the people who work the farm think that they're going to get the farm, but the other kids who didn't work the farm are also family members, and they're entitled to their share. So if you don't have something set up that deals with that issue beforehand, you could have litigation in a probate process that could last for years and could end up destroying the family business. And there are insurance considerations. So the chamber has a broker who's a member, Ann Sperling, and she gave me the suggestions for today's presentation. When you are involved in either estate planning or any kind of succession planning, insurance is an important consideration for how to deal with the death of an owner. You can get life insurance that goes to your children as beneficiaries, or is used to pay off debts for the business when you die. You can have insurance that funds the buyout of a dying owner, and you can buy what's called cross-purchase life insurance, and Ann can tell you more about that because I'm not sure what that's about. But insurance is a very important aspect of succession planning because you want a way to create financial positive that either pays bills or buys out an interest when a key player in a business passes away. If you don't have that, it creates a great deal of strain on the business. If there's a surviving spouse who is demanding a share of the business or a buyout and you don't have anything in place, such as an insurance policy and a buy-sell agreement, it can create litigation and lots of costs and can destroy the business. So here's the family farm. I just stole this picture from the internet. But, I actually have personal experience where I had family friends who owned a farm, and it was a vegetable farm. And the mother and father created it right after World War II, had a bunch of kids, only 2 or 3 of them actually operated the farm. They did go to a lawyer and create some kind of an estate planning process, but when they died, years of litigation ensued because the children who were not operating the farm felt like they weren't getting their fair share of the interest in the farm, and so it ended up basically decimating the business. And I don't even know if they're in operation today because of that. Very important issues. Tax-related issues need to be considered, and you need a good CPA. Anthony is a CPA in town who can help you with financial interests related to any kind of succession planning. And taxation issues are very important considerations that it's good to deal with up front. If you know what the tax liability is going to be and you can address it by various mechanisms up front, it's better to do that than to wait because tax liability can create a huge disaster for businesses. So then I have a series of successful family businesses and other types of businesses that created succession planning that worked. There's one. Started by one guy who decided to have some kind of a business in Arkansas that now is huge, $421 billion a year operation, but it's still operated by family members of Sam Walton. And there are children of Sam Walton who are not in the business, but who are very wealthy because of what he did, but they didn't get into a fight that destroyed the business. So they had some kind of a succession plan that worked, that kept the participant family members in the business and compensated the ones who did not participate appropriately. Ford's been around for a long time. The Ford name is still involved in the business. William Clay Ford, Jr., is the executive chairman of the business, and he is on a direct line from Henry Ford. That's a $128 billion a year operation that's successfully survived the down economy and is still going strong. Bechtel, we all know Bechtel because they're one of the owners or one of the operators of the contractor that runs the lab, at least for now. Bechtel's a family name. Started out as a small operation in San Francisco. They're now $30 billion a year operation, and they're still run by the founder, by the great-grandson of the founder, Warren Bechtel. His name is Riley Bechtel, and he is the chief executive officer of the company. So these are successful family businesses that created a business succession plan that worked and created a business that exists still today after all these years. Here's a local business success story in succession planning. So the Finishing Touch is a paint and decorating store here in Los Alamos. It's been around for many, many years. I'm sure Cheryl has been to these meetings before, but my understanding from reading the article is that she was looking for a buyer to take over her business because she had built it up and now it was time to retire, and apparently her children weren't interested in operating the business, much like I wasn't interested in working for running my dad's business after he was done. So this is a kismet succession. If you read the article, what happened was Julio and Marcelo, the new owners, they own a tile store down in Santa Fe, and they were doing some work over at CB Fox, and they talked to one of the owners at CB Fox and were told that this business was for sale. So they called up Cheryl and they worked out an arrangement, and they are now the new owners of this business. So it's going to continue on in our community and provide services and sales, retail sales for decorating and painting and interior design for many years to come, hopefully. Not so successful business successions. Dabney Decorating. So my dad started this business in the Quad City area of Illinois in the 70s. And if you know anything about the history of that area, there was a recession that hit the farm economy in the 70s, in the late 70s. And it created an economic disaster for this area. This is where John Deere's main office is. There was several factories that were John Deere factories. There was a Caterpillar factory. There was a Farmall factory. And many of them shut down or downsized because of the economy failing. And many of those people were not wealthy, but they made good money working in a factory and spent money at my dad's store. So the economy got bad and he could not survive it. He didn't go out of business, but he ended up selling his business for debt to another company, which is not the way he wanted things to go. Then I bought a newspaper years ago called the Steamboat Springs Review, and I bought it from the owners who started it 15 years prior to that. It turned out to not be a very successful effort for me. I should have stuck with practicing law, and that's what I did. I went back and I continued to practice law in Las Vegas, Nevada. Here in town, not so successful business succession. Anybody remember what this was? Hallmark store. The family that owned it ran it for many, many years, and they spent a long time trying to find a buyer and eventually gave up and just shut the business down. And it's still sitting empty today. So that's not good for our community, but it may be in part have something to do with the type of business it was because, Hallmark cards are probably not as great of a revenue generator as they used to be. There's a lot of competition in that world. And the reason my business failed in part is because I bought it when the newspaper business was heading this way as opposed to this way. And it's still heading this way. If you know anything about the newspaper business, it's not a success story anymore because of the competing internet world and all kinds of other news sources that are available today. Typewriters. They're great little antiques. You can pick them up at estate sales. That's what I do. There used to be a business in town called the Los Alamos Typewriter Exchange. Does anybody remember that business? Been gone a long time. You remember it?
I was about this tall.
Yeah,
You can tell by the phone number.
yeah. 2-6239.
It was in a sunt.
It was what?
It was in a sunt.
Some apartments aren't here anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't even think that street's there anymore. It's probably in the middle of the pond. But,
It's down by the chapels.
yeah, but you're not going to find very many typewriter businesses anymore, and before the advent of computers, they were everywhere. Now, the State Bar of New Mexico considers succession planning so important that they created a book called Succession Planning Handbook for New Mexico Lawyers. This book, you can get it online on the State Bar website. It's 162 pages long. Not only did they do this, and they borrowed this, a lot of this from the state of New Mexico, or the state of Oregon. In 2013, the state of Oregon created this resource for lawyers there. And I think the thought process was many states with rural areas, like New Mexico, like Oregon, have small law shops, sole practitioners, small law offices where there's 1 or 2 lawyers practicing, and there's nothing in place to deal with the eventuality of a lawyer in a small practice dying, becoming disabled, or shutting down the practice. So we need to protect clients as the bar from that eventuality if lawyers aren't in tune with that and do something to protect their clients. And so what they've done is they've created this resource, but this year they've notified all the lawyers in the state that they're going to pass a rule, and the rule will require every licensed lawyer in the state of New Mexico to certify that they have a succession plan in place for their law practice. That's kind of scary and kind of shows the importance of succession planning in any kind of business. The reason it's important in the practice of law, and I don't know if I agree with the State Bar of New Mexico that we're more important than anybody else, but it's important in the practice of law because if I'm representing a client in an important litigation or transactional matter, and I die, and I don't have a succession plan in place where somebody can step in and take my place, that issue or that case or that project can languish for a long period of time. And it can become very difficult for the client to replace me and get all the materials that I had prepared or created for that project or that litigation because the file's now in limbo. And there's nobody in place to transfer that file to the client so they can get a new lawyer in place. And that creates all kinds of headaches for the state bar because then the clients call the state bar and they complain about it. So we have that rule in place. But I want to read a couple of things and tell you about this book because I think this book is probably also helpful for any business owner. It has contracts and other forms that can be used in a succession planning operation or the sale of a business. Yes, sir.
So, I know you said it sounded like the state bar did all that, but was the state bar the initiators of it, or did it
Yes.
come from the Supreme Court?
Well, it may be that the Supreme Court identified it as a problem and asked the state bar to form a committee because the state bar basically serves at the pleasure of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the body that basically is the primary governing body of attorneys, but the state bar basically is the executive arm of the Supreme Court in terms of making sure that we're properly licensed and we do the things like legal education that we need to do. So the Supreme Court did write a letter that is included in this book. And I won't read the whole letter, but I want to read the last sentence in the letter because it's important to everybody in this room. And what they say is, have a plan, put it in writing, talk to your clients about the plan. Let them know that you really are looking out for their interests both now and in the future. And that's important for any business. Now, if you're selling retail, you don't really need to talk to your clients about what your plan of operation is, but you want to have a succession plan in place so that there's a seamless transfer of your business to the next if you become disabled or die, or if you just decide you don't want to do the work anymore. And I think, depending on what type of business is, any business in a small town, if you're successful, should be able to continue on after you retire or become disabled or die, because there's a demand for whatever service or business you're providing to the community. And if you're not there, then the community people have to go somewhere else to get that service. If the finishing touch had gone out of business, many people would be going to Santa Fe or Albuquerque or somewhere else to buy anything related to interior design and decorating. Then there is a section, much of this book is a series of forms, but there's a section with a sample form for the sale of a law practice, which can be used to tailor into the sale of any other type of business. And, if you have a small business and you don't want to spend a lot of money on lawyers, it's good to have forms like that, but it's also good to get some legal advice to help make sure that you tailor the form correctly. That kind of leads to my last comment about that I talked about earlier, Reid Griffith's succession plan. So Reid practiced here for 45 years, general practice of law, which is what we continue to do. And his succession plan was he was going to groom an associate to come and learn his business and take over when he decided to retire. And so he started doing that probably 15 years ago. He went through a series of about 7 or 8 different associates, and he couldn't find a single one who had any interest at all in taking over his business. And he had given up. So in March of 2016, I met him, and my wife lives here and works at the lab, and so she thought it was a good idea for me to be a little closer to home and practice here. So she actually told me about Reid, thought that he was still practicing, and he was, but when I met him, his game plan was, I'm going to shut down my practice at the end of the year. I'm done. I can't find anybody to take it over, and I'm just going to quit and transfer all my clients to other lawyers. So that's what he was going to do. Then I met him, and he kind of showed me around and took me down to Santa Fe, where much of the work that we do in court has to be done down there. And we hit it off, and we reached an agreement on how I would work for him for the remainder of that year, take on clients, do the work, and see if we had a good fit. And if we did, then the game plan was for me to start my own practice in the same office, and then I would kind of be the lead, and he would continue with his practice, but his practice would basically be working for my firm. And so that's what we did all of last year, and we're continuing that into this year. And it kind of was a seamless transition. He was able to show me, the primary ways of practicing here, because every state is different. I mean, I practiced for 30 years in Las Vegas, Nevada. They do things a lot differently there than they do here. And I'm practicing in different areas than I practice there. So I had to learn how to be a general practitioner, and that's no easy task. So it was a great learning experience for me. It was a great transition for him, because now he can feel comfortable in retiring and knowing that there's still a law firm in town that can continue to represent clients in general practice matters. We do a little bit of everything unless it's too complex, and then we refer you to somebody who's specialized. But that's his Kismet succession plan. It just worked out for him. He was very fortunate, and I was very fortunate that we met each other, and it kind of similar to the finishing touch. And that's often the way things come about. So lawyers and professionals can talk until they're blue in the face, but sometimes it's just dumb luck. So let's have a discussion. Anybody have questions or want to talk about business in small town America?
You started out with a disclaimer about, what I say in this presentation, blah, 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 and it sounded like you have a broad view of succession planning?
I do. And I can help with some level of succession planning, but if you have a large, complicated business arrangement, I'm going to refer you to somebody else. It's also important to have a team. You want a lawyer, but you also, more importantly, want a good CPA who can help you with the financial aspects of succession planning. And if you're looking to sell your business, you want to make sure that you have a good, reputable business broker who can help you sell your business. And you have to do it confidentially, because if everybody knows that you're selling your business, it's not really that good for your business. Although I think the decorating business was actually actively and publicly looking for somebody to buy her business. And she wasn't having a lot of success until she got hooked up with the guys who were working doing the job at CB Fox. And so, yeah, I can help, but if it's complicated, I will refer you out to somebody else. Because we are a general practice firm, and if it gets down into the really difficult details of a multi-million-dollar kind of a business, you don't want me. Other questions? What's everybody think about doing business in a small town like Los Alamos? Knowing that we're in a unique environment. Many small towns have, had really difficult years. Yes, sir.
Okay, so part of the problem has come up, and it's going to continue to come up, is that, the county's on this big kick that if a building sits empty for so long, you basically have to tear it down. And, that's just chasing our tails, because there's no way someone's going to be able to afford to rebuild that thing. And the building is, most of the time, not such in disrepair that it can't be dealt with, except maybe the Hilltop House. But there's plenty of other, and that would be a unique situation anyway, but there's plenty of, I'm just thinking, the old Messrs building right over here, that thing is gonna get to a point where, it's too expensive to maybe buy or renovate up to whatever the code is, or they're gonna wanna tear it down, then you have nothing for someone else to do. And I think that situation, because, that's part of the problem is that in here where we don't have, land to go do something cheaper, you can't afford to, the guy in White Rock was stuck,
Yeah.
Because either had not enough money to remodel or come up with a better idea, and then the county's just dead set. You're done. Get out. We'd rather have a blank slate.
Yeah.
Just totally ignorant.
Yeah, and some of that's political, some of it could be legal. If the county doesn't require demolition of a building and the building is not safe.
What way is there to really kind of force that issue that you can't really do that, because you're kind of,
Well, yeah.
from fair trade.
I mean, I think, litigation of an issue like that could probably be almost as expensive as tearing the building down and rebuilding it. That's part of the problem. But yeah, it can be a political problem, but it also can be a real problem. And if there are real problems with a building that create structural safety issues and that sort of stuff, and the county doesn't do anything, then the building collapses on people and they die. You got to think about that kind of a terrible outcome. So there's a balancing test, and there has to be some good solid basis for the county to do what they're doing. And if there's not, and you litigate, you also have to have a good solid basis to show that they are doing it for some reason that's not rationally related to a legitimate government purpose, and that can be expensive.
I think that's
Yeah.
I don't think there's anybody.
There is the political process, and you can vote them all out and get somebody else in. I don't know how much that helps, because part of the problem is you have, a county that also has, and any local government has elected officials, but then they have hired officials. And the people who are actually, doing the day-to-day work in local government are the ones who make the important decisions many times. They're supposed to be carrying out the game plan of the elected officials, but elected officials come and go, and those folks stay for years and years. And so they may have their own agenda about how things are done, and it may not be the same agenda that the elected officials have, and that creates an internal clash there. So it's a difficult problem, but it's not an uncommon problem. That probably happens in every small town in America to some degree. So, yeah, yes, sir.
So what do you mean actually, general practice lawyer? Does that mean it's like a primary doctor, everybody have one, check regularly, and if anything?
Yeah, something like that. So general practice means we kind of take what people bring to us and we do what we can to help them. And if we can't help them, we try to find them somebody who can. So what we typically do, about 40% of my practice is family law. People want to get a divorce, people want to adopt some children, people, have fights over custody, people have other tangentially related family law issues. That's a lot of our practice. Then we get occasional criminal cases that we represent people on, and we defend people who are accused of crimes and help negotiate resolutions or do whatever we have to do to help them. And if it's a real serious, if somebody's charged with murder or a sexual assault or something like that, we're going to do so much. But if we can't help the client and it's becomes too difficult, it becomes a real serious problem, we'll refer you down to a firm that only does criminal practice. We do estate planning. Wills, trusts, that sort of thing. And we have a very simplified approach to estate planning because the New Mexico probate code allows for parties to have a simplified way to deal with their assets when they die. And which is good, because if you go to a state like California and you have a small estate, their rules and statutes are so complex that you pay more than what your estate's worth sometimes to deal with it. And then when you die, your family members have to go through a process that's long and expensive. Here, you don't have to do that. And we also do the probate work that becomes necessary if there's fights or if there's complications, and we help parties get through the probate process. We do business litigation. We create business contracts. We form business entities for people. So it's really a generalized practice of law. Do some administrative practice. I practiced as a construction and commercial litigator for years in Nevada, and so I also do that and continue to represent clients in construction disputes and civil litigation. So, yes, ma'am.
Do you do any historic preservation?
I have not done any of that, but Emma may be interested in doing that. So Emma did a lot of commercial litigation through an insurance defense firm, but she has other interests, and she might be interested in doing that and may have some experience. I'd have to ask her. Or you can call us. There's cards over here. All right. Any other questions?
Can I go briefly just on business valuation and having someone appraise your business? Because I guess in my opinion, I think it's a fine line. It comes down to what the buyer is willing to buy your business for.
Yes.
Whatever algorithm that you might.
Well, the concept of fair market value is just that, what a willing buyer is willing to pay and what a willing seller is willing to take. That's the fair market value. But appraising it and having somebody come up with a fair market value is really, they call it expert work, but in some ways it's just total guesswork.
Okay.
And so you just have to.
Is there generally, I guess in your experience, have you seen the value of doing that, or is it just almost the same as?
I think it's important to have some kind of a value. And depending on the type of business you have, your value can be calculated based on different things. Number one, your income stream. That can give you a basis for determining value. Number two, your net profit can be a basis for determining value. That gets a little tricky in small businesses because your net profit may be extremely low, but you may be generating cash flow because you're, spending money in the business that you otherwise would have to spend on your own if you were employed with somebody else. And that doesn't show up at the bottom line on the net income. But this young man over here can probably tell you more about how best to evaluate your business depending on what your business is. Real estate, if you own real estate in your business or if you own the building where the business sits, that adds value and is probably a separate appraisal that's done to to determine what it's worth. My dad, when he bought his business, he just bought the business. And he bought it from a couple that was getting divorced, and he bought it for very cheap because they were in a hurry to, split the sheets and move on down the road. Then they got cold feet. They didn't like the price that they paid or that they were going to get paid, and so they went to a lawyer to try to break the contract. And my dad, who was not a lawyer, graduated from high school, he found a house contract at some form store, and he used that. But the lawyer looked at it and said, yeah, no, you can't break that contract. And so he still was able to buy the business. But then as he developed the business and it grew, and he was successful for 15 years before the market took him down, he eventually bought the property where the business was located. And it was a little professional center that had a separate store where his business was started. But the other building was a big building that had a dentist's office and I think a hair salon and some other professional offices it was a 2-story building. So he bought that whole property and he moved his decorating store onto the first floor of that bigger building and then turned the smaller building into a complete art store. And then when he sold it, he sold the whole thing, the business and the property, to another company called Dick Blick, which is a big art supply company in the Midwest. And he sold it for debt. He didn't make any money off of it, but then he was allowed to work. He worked for them for another 5 or 6 years before he retired. So.
All right. Well, if you have any further questions for Philip, his card is over here, and you can give him a call. We've run just past our usual time, so I want to thank everybody for coming.
Thank you all very much for the opportunity, and have a great day.
Thank